Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. It's often said that the Roaring Twenties was a time of economic expansion because America realized that the business of America is business. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this class today, you should be able to characterize the goals and results of the Harding administration. You should be able to identify the scandals associated with the Harding administration. You should be able to examine the winners and losers in the new consumer society of the 1920s. And you should be able to explain the rising importance of civil liberties in the 1920s. But let's begin in our first Roman numeral. Here I want to talk about basically the transition from wartime to peacetime in those years after the Great War. Because the failure of progressivism as a movement is often seen as the result of the cultural hysteria of the wartime era. The chaos of the time seemed to prove that there was too few of the rational, self-directed citizens to handle the challenges of a new progressivism. The social turmoil of the progressive era, the war years, the instability of the economy, as all those things became added together, it left Americans longing for really a time of quiet stability. In 1920, Republican Warren G. Harding was elected to president on his campaign promise of a return to normalcy. Voter turnout in the 1920 election was low, and people were basically just worn out on politics altogether. Subpoint B. When Harding gets elected to office, he selects his cabinet, and Harding comes into office with kind of a particular position on how government should operate. He favored a limited government role in business and in social reform. In this way, we might say that Harding is kind of the anti-progressive. Progressives who thought the government could be involved in every factor of American life. Harding really wanted a limited role for government there. He did set up, though, a few things that we might look at as an expansion of government, creating a new government bureau, this one the Bureau of the Budget, whose job it was to help the government run efficiently. And he did use some powers of the bully pulpit to go use influence on organizations like U.S. Steel, a private company, but using the power of the White House to encourage U.S. Steel to stop their 12-hour work days, which were seen as abusive towards workers. Harding also sets up his cabinet by appointing a number of really capable people to his office. A few of them I'd like you to meet. The first one, Charles Evans Hughes. Charles Evans Hughes was the former Supreme Court Justice. He was the one-time challenger to Woodrow Wilson in 1916. He served as Secretary of State in the Harding administration and later as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Also, Herbert Hoover. Now, at one point, Herbert Hoover is going to be, a villain in American history, but in the years after World War I, Herbert Hoover was considered like this amazing genius who was great at everything. He was a mining engineer, so his job was to go work in petroleum and mineral mining. But he used a scientific approach towards food relief and distribution and refugee services during and after the Great War. It's often said that Herbert Hoover single-handedly kept a continent from slipping into starvation, which he did basically as a charity organization, using no public funds, but just raising resources from people and then shipping over goods to Europe in the years after the Great War. He was widely seen as a genius of everything he did and was appointed as Secretary of Commerce during the Harding administration. And also Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was one of the richest people in America in 1920. He was named Secretary of the Treasury, and he put off what some people think of as almost like black magic today, that he was able to dramatically cut taxes and yet at the same time reduce the national debt. Andrew Mellon was seen as like a wizard of finance. But Harding also appointed a number of real scoundrels to office, notably a group known as the Ohio Gang. The Ohio Gang were basically his friends from back home that he brought into government with him, brought into the White House, and appointed to a number of government positions. They were, frankly, I think we could say corrupt, and they were an embarrassment to the Harding administration. More about that later. Also, Harding inherited a number of international problems. After World War I, the United States faced international problems with things like arms control and war debts and the reconstruction of war-torn countries. To settle these problems, Harding basically called together a world summit. He hosted what's known as the Washington Naval Conference. And naval, think like navies, not belly buttons. But he calls together the Washington Naval Conference, and he invited essentially all of the world's major powers to the table, all except Russia. By this point, it had become the Soviet Union, and it was a little unclear on what terms you could deal with this new country. But at the Washington Naval Conference, United States Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes proposed a major disarmament. He said that the United States would take the lead and that other countries should follow on stopping building warships for at least the next 10 years, for the next decade, and that the biggest naval powers in the world should actually be reducing the size of their navies, should be decommissioning largest warships. This is a remarkable change in policy from all of the build-up years of going into World War I and the militarization and the impact of sea power on history and Alfred Thayer McHann and all of those things. At the Washington Naval Conference, the tide begins to turn, and the United States and Great Britain and Japan and France and Italy all agreed to cut their fleets. The Washington Naval Conference seemed like it was a bright promise of a future tomorrow, and they cried and cheered with optimism for the world that might be coming. Subpoint D. Now, the countries that we had fought alongside with in World War I, it actually owed the United States a pretty fair amount of money. Britain and France owed roughly $10 billion, and that's billion dollars in 1920 dollars, roughly $10 billion in wartime loans. And they intended to go pay those loans back by selling goods to the United States or by collecting reparations payments from Germany. But in 1922, Congress passed a law known as the Ford-Macumber tariff, which raised taxes on U.S. imports, and it raised it pretty significantly by 60%. It was actually the highest level that tariffs had ever been on. It protected the United States businesses from foreign competition, or at least that's what tariff proponents argue, that it protects businesses from foreign competition, but it also meant that Britain and France really couldn't repay their debts. That prompted Britain and France to go step up collections from Germany. Germany was facing high inflation problems and really was unable to go repay France. When Germany defaulted, France seized that German land, and they did so, but it also led fears to resparking war. It looked like now France and Great Britain were taking over German territory, and is this going to set off an international dispute? To avoid that thought of war, a United States banker named Charles Dawes was sent to negotiate new loans with Germany. The Dawes Plan of 1924. Now, there's a couple of things in history that sound pretty similar. There's the Dawes Plan, which is this like loan repayment plan from World War I. There's also the Dawes Act, which is unrelated, and it's important to kind of keep those distinct. Here we're talking about the Dawes Plan, the 1924 plan, which loaned to Germany $2.5 billion. Basically, so we take American money and loan it to Germany. Germany then tries to get caught up on its payments to Great Britain and France. So they began to repay their reparations to those countries. Those countries owe money to the United States, and so they pay that money back to the United States, which means that in a circuitous roundabout way, the United States is paying itself back with American money funneled through the other countries. Everybody kind of hates this deal. All sides resented the Dawes Act of 1924, the Dawes Plan of 1924. Britain and France accused the United States of not paying their fair share of the costs of World War I, and yet profiting off the war that cost, millions of Europeans, both in dollars and lives. The United States said, we're repaying your debts with our own money, and Britain and France, you guys are the ones that are financially responsible. You're borrowing money with debts that you just can't pay back. Roman numeral next. The Harding administration quickly became, I think we can just say, one of the most corrupt administrations in American history. The Ohio Gang, which we'd previously met in our last Roman numeral, the Ohio Gang used their positions in government. Now remember, the Ohio Gang are like the buddies of Harding, or appointed to various positions. They used their positions in government to become wealthy through a process known as graft. Graft is using a government job for political gain. A couple of standout names here include Charles Forbes. Charles Forbes was head of the Veterans Bureau, was caught illegally selling government and Veterans Administration hospital supplies to go to private companies and then pocketing the profits for himself. Or Colonel Thomas Miller, who was the head of the Office of Alien Property. And when I say alien property, I don't want you to think like UFOs. I want you to think like alien as in foreign property. Essentially, it's the tariffs or the customs office. Colonel Thomas Miller was the head of the Office of Alien Property and was caught for taking bribes, basically taking payments to go overlook customs duties. Harding himself was not corrupt. We don't really have any evidence that he was deceitful in his business or government practices. There might be some evidence he wasn't that good of a husband, but that's kind of beside the point of where we're going today. Harding wasn't corrupt himself, but he did preside over an administration which was rife with corruption. While Harding himself might be honest, as the head of the team, the coach carries the weight. Subpoint B, the biggest scandal of the Harding administration was that known as Teapot Dome. Teapot Dome was a resource-rich area of central Wyoming. There, Secretary of the Interior, a guy named Albert Fall, so Secretary of the Interior is the one in charge of managing public lands. I think I've mentioned before that it's like such a perfectly Washington, D.C. idea to say who manages things outside the Department of Interior. But basically, so it's this resource-rich land in central Wyoming that is owned by the federal government. It's got for mining, for petroleum purposes, and Albert Fall has, he takes all of the oil reserves, which had been under the purview of the Department of the Navy, and moved them to the Interior Department. Basically saying like oil reserves during the Navy might make sense during wartime. This is peacetime. We're really talking about American resources. This should be Department of Interior, which I think is a fair argument to make. Then, though, Albert Fall basically leased the land, gave rights to the land to two petroleum companies, which were kind of like his buddies, in exchange for somewhere around $400,000 worth of kickbacks along the way. Albert Fall was caught by this. He was arrested. He became actually the first person in United States history to be convicted of a felony while still serving in the United States cabinet. Warren Harding, kind of considering the scandals of his administration, whether it's Charles Miller or whether it's Albert Fall and Teapot Dome, and he says, I really have no problems with my enemies. And, he was a newspaper publisher and a politician. He certainly had his enemies. He says, I have no trouble with my enemies, but my friends, they're the ones that keep me walking floors at night. On August 2nd of 1923, sick with the stress of the scandal, and Harding suddenly died of a heart attack, or maybe a stroke. It's 1920s medicine wasn't super clear. Harding died, and he died an enormously popular president. He restored that sense of normalcy after the turmoil of the Progressive era, the conflicts of the Wilson years, the weight of World War I, and Harding spun it into what would become the Roaring '20s. But Harding also died just as all of his administration scandals were coming to light, and it tarnished his reputation really for history. A lot of presidents deal with scandals in their administration, but most of them live long enough to fix the problem and to repair their legacy. Harding doesn't. He dies just as it's breaking open, and his reputation suffers for it. A lot of people don't consider Harding to be really that great of a president, considering the scandals that he had. I've always wondered if that's totally fair, because he just didn't have time to fix them. Subpoint D, the 1920s, whether the Harding administration or his successor, reflected a pro-business ethos. In 1924, which would be year of election, so Harding dies. His vice president, a guy named Calvin Coolidge, takes over in 1923, and then it turns around 1924 is an election year. And that year, the Democratic Party was sharply divided. On one side, you have John Davis, who actually becomes the nominee of the Democratic Party, but he was unevenly supported and really took less than 30% of the whole popular vote. There was also progressive Robert La Follette, whom we met during our progressive era. He's the guy like Fightin' Bob of Wisconsin, right? He takes some Democrat votes, kind of like the old Wilsonian progressives are voting for Robert La Follette. but he carries about 60% of the popular vote. But Calvin Coolidge, Harding's vice president, Calvin Coolidge won office. He won 35 states in the election of 1924 in the Electoral College, 54% of the popular vote, and Calvin Coolidge becomes elected, not really like re-elected because he wasn't elected the first time, but whatever, like he becomes elected president in 1924 and retains office. Coolidge exemplified what was seen as Yankee honesty. He was a man from Massachusetts, kind of a Northeasterner, was just seen as like an honest and simple, plain-spoken kind of guy. It was a welcome characteristic after the Harding years, which people were beginning to wonder if, like, are all Republicans sort of tainted? And you get Calvin Coolidge, who just seems like a pretty simple, honest guy. He expanded the pro-business ethos of the 1920s as government policies were out pushing for lower taxes and higher tariffs and an anti-union type of legislation. Roman numeral next. So Calvin Coolidge takes office and he has a real pro-business policy. Let's talk first about his economic policy. He favored minimal government interference in business. This type of policy allowed private enterprise to really flourish during his administration. He also encouraged high tariffs, which would go help American manufacturers because tariffs make imports look more expensive. So if you're producing domestically, like domestic made stuff looks like it's going to be cheaper, so that helps American manufacturers. Wages and productivity were on the rise, and this is a pretty sharp change from the progressive era. The progressives were all about lowering tariffs, which really created instability among American industry. There's certainly an argument to be made that it's better for the economy to have low tariffs, but it didn't feel like it protected American jobs. But Coolidge really goes out there and protects them with high tariffs along the way. Subpoint B. Coolidge is also the president of the automobile. And cars in the 1920s were truly changing life. If you think about all of the parts of our country which support automobiles, paved roads and gas stations and motels and shopping centers, they stretched across the country. Cars gave mobility to rural families and to women and to young people, giving freedom and independence far beyond the reach of a horse. It also let workers live pretty far away from their jobs, so the car becomes the vehicle of urban sprawl. Cars also changed architecture. Suddenly, houses have to have driveways and garages. They have to be built onto or in addition to an American house. Motels and repair shops and gasoline stations and tourist camps and shopping centers would all spring up, either to support car life or be enabled by it. Take, for instance, Route 66, the legendary westward route from Chicago to Los Angeles. And towns along the route became important, both culturally and economically. When you watch the Pixar movie Cars and you think about Radiator Springs, that's real life in the 1920s. The auto industry also became an economic base for a number of cities. Take Akron, Ohio, or in Michigan, Detroit, Dearborn, Flint, and Pontiac. They all grew up to support the automobile factories. Oil-producing states like California or Texas, they became key to the petroleum industry and made fast profits from all their resources. By the late 1920s, there was one car for every 5 Americans, and the automobile became the status symbol of choice. Americans owned 80% of every car on Earth. It was an American-owned car. It was the perfect status symbol of the Coolidge era. People, even at fairly modest means, even if you didn't have a lot of money, you could own a life-changing machine. Subpoint C. Here I also want to talk about a different type of transportation, the airplane industry. The airplane industry in the 1920s was not well established. We have planes, but it's not that great of a technology yet. That changes in this decade. The airplane industry started out as a mail service, really for the post office in 1918. But as training and technology improved, air travel became a more reliable method of transportation. Weather forecasting and mobile radios and navigation tools all improved safety and reliability. Henry Ford, of automaking fame, developed a tri-motor plane in 1926, and the Lockheed Company produced the Vega in 1927. It was a popular single-engine transport plane in the 1920s. Inspired by successful transatlantic flights of Charles Lindbergh in 1927, and a few years later by Amelia Earhart in 1934, Pan American Airways opened in 1927 for international airmail and passenger service. Subpoint D. As consumer goods were proliferating, Marketed by salespeople and advertisers, they were promoted as ways of satisfying Americans' real needs and desires. Americans spent more and more of their income on leisure activities like vacations and movies and sporting events. Americans considered their standard of living to be a sacred acquisition, that it seems like God himself had chosen Americans to live a richer and better life. War-ravaged Europeans were looking over at American society and seeing Americans' consumer goods and soaring standard of living, and frankly, it just felt like an amazing sight. Hollywood films and visual artists exported the image of a modern industrial America. But the fruits of increased production were unevenly distributed. And this is a story that's not well told about the Roaring Twenties. By 1929, there was an estimated 40% of the population still living in poverty, and various levels of what might be considered poverty. But the Roaring Twenties, while it is a time of economic expansion, it's worth noting that the rising tide didn't lift all the boats very evenly. Roman numeral number next. Here I want to talk about kind of the life on the ground for people in the era. And first let's talk about what it's like for women in the 1920s. The achievement of suffrage in 1920, the women, recognizing the right to vote, eliminated any bond of unity between various feminist activists. Black feminists crusaded for further enforcement of the 15th Amendment in the South. A number of white feminists joined the dwindling Socialist Party to support women's rights. But essentially the glue which held together the women's movement was the right to vote, and having achieved it, the glue didn't seem to hold anymore. There's a real fractioning in women's rights movements. Take, for instance, Alice Paul's National Women's Party. They proposed an amendment to the Constitution known as the Equal Rights Amendment, which would eliminate all legal distinctions on account of sex. Political equality meant legal equality, and the protections afforded to women in the progressive era honestly didn't seem that appropriate too much by the 1920s anymore. The idea of protectionism and a protected class of women, it just didn't seem like a sense of equality anymore. Other than the National Women's Party, though, every major women's organization opposed the ERA, opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, because it felt like maybe they were throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and that women's rights would actually be damaged by ERA because the protections that women had would be suddenly lost. But female liberation resurfaced as a lifestyle in advertising and mass entertainment, and I think this is how we usually understand women in society of the 1920s. They became the iconic image of the flapper as an emancipated young woman embracing the new fashions and urban attitudes of the day. Magazines and newspapers were pretty eager to capitalize on that flapper image, even more than 1920s era American women actually lived the flapper lifestyle. It, like most perfected images, was just one more unattainable and maybe even undesirable, idealized standard of perfection that seems to be something Americans constantly just go chase. Still, the clothing fashions and the general attitude of leaving tradition behind, it was a major cultural movement for women. In that goal of equality, women began smoking cigarettes and drinking in public and openly talking about sex, things that would have ruined the reputation of women a generation before, and of course, all that dancing. Attitudes in marriage were beginning to change also. Middle-class men and women began to see marriage really as an equal partnership, although equal is only so equal as housework and child rearing were still mostly a woman's job. Older generations were largely disapproving of this new liberal culture, though, and the reality is that morals really only loosened so far. Churches and schools weren't all that accepting of the new casual dances and smoking and drinking. Subpoint B. The looser public morals brought new resistance as people wanted to keep some kind of moral boundaries in society. The Postal Service removed books from the shelves that it deemed to be obscene, including the 16th century French poetry and modern novels by James Joyce, and there was a feeling that maybe America could do something to, reel in its own morals. Locals in Boston excluded books from city bookstores, including works by Upton Sinclair and Ernest Hemingway. Over time, this backfired as a work became banned in Boston. It even earned new attention as work that was appealingly risque. In 1922, the film industry tried to regulate itself with what's known as the Hays Code, a policy of prohibiting sexual content and carefully writing how criminals or clergy were to be portrayed in socially correct ways. A number of American artists and writers ended up saying there's not really any artistic or creative freedom in this, and just leaving the country altogether for Paris. Most notably, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, part of a larger group that writer and critic Gertrude Stein referred to as the Lost Generation, a term to describe the directionlessness of people that came of age after World War I. So point C. Here I want to talk about the Supreme Court's role in civil liberties, and it begins not with the Supreme Court, but with a lawyers' organization known as the American Civil Liberties Union. You'll often see this abbreviated as the ACLU, which was established in 1920 in response to the Espionage and Sedition Acts of the war years. The ACLU's goal was to promote civil liberties in court. Now, just a little bit of political science terms here. Civil liberties and civil rights are a little bit different. Civil liberties are basically protections from government overreach. So if you have freedom of speech that you could stand in the corner and say, the president is a poopy head, right? The government can't come and arrest you for that. Now, your boss might fire you from your job for it because you don't have the civil right to do whatever you want, but you do have the civil liberty that the government can't persecute you for having an unpopular opinion. The ACLU was established to enforce those civil liberties or government overreach on the liberties that people have. The Supreme Court of the United States, the truth is, by the 1920s, had a pretty mixed record on how good it was at protecting civil rights, civil liberties, in the many years before World War I. But now, by the 1920s, it faced increased pressure to defend those liberties, but also to recognize where its limits were. Ultimately, the Espionage Act, which we met earlier in this unit, the Espionage Act was found constitutional, that it was legal to have limits on freedom of speech because some speech presents what's known as a clear and present danger to the public. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes explained that, for instance, the First Amendment doesn't prohibit somebody from being in a crowded theater and yelling, "Fire, fire," just for the joy of causing a panic. If, that's dangerous. That actually causes the panic and it could get people hurt, and you don't have that right to do that. Holmes and Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis we met earlier as the father of the Brandeis Brief, using social statistics and social evidence to go argue court cases. He was appointed to the Supreme Court by Wilson. And Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis began to speak up for freedom of speech, such as a person's right to an unpopular opinion and the ability to join even unpopular groups like the Communist Party, but also to go beyond defending just solely political speech, that there's other types of speech which could be protected that aren't about calling a president a poopy head, but might be otherwise limits of the government. Those questions of where does freedom lie? What is the rights that people have in a changing world that is, it seems like the old way isn't working anymore, or just is tired and worn out, and where are we going to go next? All of those questions are a terrific story that I just can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.